Today we start a 6-week adventure together at First Mission Church. Turn to your neighbor and say, "Are you ready?"
Are you ready?
It's starting today. It's an adventure in pleasing God. This adventure is about changing who we are going to please with our lives, how we are going to become different, and how we are going to make our world different. So I have a question for you. When you wake up in the morning, when you turn out of that bed and you stretch and you go, "All right, who are you going to live that day for? Or what do you live that day for?" Think about it for a moment. When you wake up, what gets you going other than that pot and a half of coffee? You mean you don't all drink a pot and a half of coffee before you start the day? I want you to know that there are two kinds of answers to this question. Anyone want to guess what they might be? What do people live for? We could make a list. See if any of these things would be on your list of what you live for. Work. Any of you live for work? Okay, maybe not. Maybe that wasn't a good choice. Family. Any of you live for family? That's a big one. Money. Stuff. How many of you have stuff?
Oh, too much.
Kids. Family. It keeps coming back. Now I have to tell you that all of these fit into one category. Now how many categories did I say there was? Two. And all of those things that I just talked about fit into one category. And that is the category we will call self. All of those things. Our kids, our family, our work, our job, our money. That's all about me. All about who I am. All about self. Now there is another category, but we don't talk about it very often, it seems. And that category is the category we might label as God. Did any of you think about that being option number 2? These are the two options. No matter how you break it down, there are two answers to the question, what do you live for? According to the Bible, you can live for one or for the other. You can't live for both. You can love and serve yourself and all the things that go with that. Or you can love and serve God. Now, aren't you glad that the preacher has made life this easy? Isn't that easy? There's self and there's God. Two choices. You all thought there were lots of choices in life. But this is how life has broken down our choices. And many of us have spent our entire lives working to please ourselves. To become, as the Army would tell us, all we can be. I always thought that was interesting. The Army's slogan, "Be all you can be," has become an army of one. I don't know if you've noticed that, but in their information, they've gone to be all you can be, to be an army of one. I think that is typical of how and who we are becoming as a society. Most of us in this room have worked hard. We've given to our kids. We've tried to create stability in our lives. Some of us in the room have read every self-help book there is. We've been to seminars. We've bought every foolproof system there is. And yet, every person in this room knows that living for ourselves just doesn't ever seem to be enough. It doesn't bring lasting pleasure to live simply to please ourselves. Now there's a word we know about in this church and about in our world. We know about pleasure. How many of you know about pleasure? and this is good news for those of us who like pleasure, God has equipped us to enjoy things. Whew. Boy, you're glad about that, aren't you? I am. God has given us eyes to see beauty with. God has given us ears to hear the ocean waves crashing and music dancing like the choir just sang. God has given us skin to feel sensation with and a tongue to taste those delectable delights. And a nose. Oh, we love our nose when it smells that fresh bread baking. The problem is that human beings as a whole, and Americans, I believe in particular, even those of us in this church here today, have taken these five senses and turned them into an end unto themselves. For most of us will tell you, if it doesn't look good, we don't watch. If it doesn't sound good, we turn it off. If it doesn't taste good, we don't partake. Feel good, we don't touch. And smell good? Well, you know how well you liked it when you were standing next to someone with bad BO. Isn't it true? Isn't all that true? I think that most of us in the room are just a little bit like the rich young ruler who came to visit Jesus one day. You remember the story of the rich young ruler that's found in all four Gospels. He comes to Jesus and he's got a great question. He comes to Jesus and says, Jesus, how do I inherit eternal life? How do I get into the kingdom of heaven? How do I join up? He wanted to know how to enter the kingdom of heaven. But when he was given the answer, he couldn't do it. He couldn't do it, not because he couldn't keep the rules. He had kept the rules all of his life. He couldn't do it because he couldn't give up the feel of fine horses under him. The warmth and the texture of the fine clothes he wore. Or the fine foods that adorned his table. In other words, he couldn't get into the kingdom of heaven because he couldn't simply take the focus off of himself. Now, our text from Romans and from Colossians today helps us to understand his problem. And the fact is, his problem is probably our problem. It is a problem of worship. And the problem is the object of our worship. Is there anyone here today who thinks there might be a problem with the object of our worship in our world? I think we might have a problem. Now, see, that was the easy question. What about with the object of worship in our world? Paul's letter to the Colossians makes it clear who our worship is supposed to focus on. If you heard and listened to Anthony read it, you heard him say things like, our worship is to focus on Jesus, the firstborn of all creation, the image of the invisible God, the one in whom all things in heaven and on earth were created, the one who is before all things, and in him all things are held together. Oh, this beautiful hymn in Colossians describes Jesus. He's the head of the body. He's the beginning and the end, the firstborn from the dead, the one where all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. He was pleased to reconcile to himself and to God all things through the blood of the cross. He is the one who has now reconciled you and I to the Father, making us holy and blameless. in Romans, Paul teaches us to respond to God's amazing love shown in Jesus by presenting our bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God. In our culture, sacrifice is a hard word, isn't it? Oh, we know what it means, kind of. We've seen it in our servicemen and women. Military personnel who risk and live their lives for our freedom. Police and fire departments who respond to emergencies and keep us safe without thought of their own safety. When we stop long enough to consider these, we are inspired by their acts of service and their sacrifices. But Paul's letter to the Romans doesn't stop there. Doesn't stop with our definition of service. Paul urges us to live differently, to not conform our lives to the way of this world, but to be transformed to the way of Christ, the way of God, by the renewing of our minds. This is what it means to really worship, to sacrifice our focus on self, to focus on living God's way. And when we do this, God is pleased. For this is worship. Take a deep breath with me and imagine pleasing God. This time, close your eyes and take a deep breath. And imagine pleasing God through your spiritual worship. Close your eyes and breathe in and imagine. There are two things I want to share with you that are very important about this. Two things that are very important about our worship, as Paul describes it. These are things that you should write down. These are things that you might want to put on your mirror when you're getting ready in the morning for the day, and on your refrigerator when you prepare for a meal. And be reminded about worship. The first thing is this. Real worship that Paul's talking about here is not for your benefit. That's right. Real worship is not for your benefit. Turn to a neighbor and say that to them. Real worship is not for your benefit. So many times I have heard people say things like, of course now nobody will say these things to me, but they say things like, worship, or the sermon, or the choir, the music, really touched my life today. Or they'll say things like, well, I sure didn't get anything out of that. These comments are usually made on your way out of church. Sometimes they're made in the parking lot afterwards. But I always smile when I hear them. But inside, I'm saddened. I'm sad because with that sentence, I understand that we've missed the point. Worship is not about you. It's not about me. It's not about the choir. It's not about the band. It's not about the piano players. It's not about you or me. Worship is simply about the response we bring to God. The fact is that if you get something or not out of worship, may be, in fact, is really directly related to what you bring to worship. If you really want to get something out of worship, I believe you have to bring something into worship. And that something, Paul tells us, is our whole being. Worship is what we bring to God at every point in our lives, including but not limited to, by the way, to Sunday morning. It's essential for us to understand this, that in order to please God through our worship, in order to please God in any way, our focus must be on what we bring to God at every point in our lives. Not just on Sunday morning. What this means is that Monday morning, I know how many of you love Monday mornings. Monday mornings are just as important as Sunday mornings. Friday nights, Sunday mornings, the same. What we bring to God. That's what this text from Romans is really about. It's about waking up every single morning and saying, I'm giving myself wholly to God today. I wonder how many of you walked through the doors into worship today. Most of you walked through, right? How many of you walked through saying, I'm here to glorify God with everything that I am through His Son, Jesus Christ, today? Understand this. If you want to be transformed, if you want to please God, you have to lay your life on the altar every day as a living sacrifice. That's what Paul says. This means using your five senses and all the gifts God has given you to not pursue your own pleasure, but to pursue God and His pleasure. Now this is an adventure. And it's going to change the way you live. If you're on this adventure, I'm going to tell you worship will no longer just be a Sunday morning event. Those of you who are already living this way will confirm what I'm saying. It will no longer be just a part of your life's schedule because, and this is point number 2, because, write this down, real worship will be your way of life. You see, as we commit to focusing on pleasing God, we become a living sacrifice. And to become a living sacrifice, here is what you need to focus on. And you find this in verses 3 through 21 of chapter 12 of Romans. If you kept your finger there, you can glance down there. But here's what I really want you to do with this passage. I want you to read Romans chapter 12 every day this week. Because in order to become a living sacrifice, we have to focus on some things. And as we focus on becoming this living sacrifice, you will begin to focus on thinking of yourself more fully as a part of the body of Christ. You will focus on looking for ways to use your spiritual gifts for Jesus and for the world. You will focus on loving people genuinely from the heart. You will focus on holding fast to the good and letting go of the evil. You will focus on outdoing one another and showing honor. You will focus on rejoicing in hope, being patient in your suffering, and persevering in prayer. You will focus on contributing to the needs of the saints and showing hospitality to the strangers in our midst. And you will focus on blessing those who persecute